Denison is 151 years old. It was established on the Red River. It was a railroad town initially. Denison's probably famous for three people. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was born in Denison. Sully Sullenberger became famous for his heroic acts. And then way back, T.V. Munson, who saved the wine industry. One day, we had a group of people walk in and say, hey, we're the Likarish family, and we want to start a distillery.
I'm Maggie Kimbrell, content editor of American Whisky Magazine, and I'm here in Denison, Texas to visit my friends at the Ironroot Republic Distillery. Close to the border with Oklahoma, Denison has a long history of winemaking and is a sister city to Cognac, France. Ironroot Republic takes its name from the iron roots of Texas that saved the European wine industry from the pest phylloxera in the late 1800s. Founded by the Likarish family, Robert, Jonathan, Marcia, and John, Ironroot Republic is now celebrating its 10th anniversary and has become famous for its pioneering, terroir-driven approach to making bourbon and corn whiskey. Having handed them so many World Whiskies Awards certificates over the years, I decided it was time to see where their award-winning whiskeys are made and learn more about what making Texas whiskey means to them.
Mom and Dad were not big drinkers when I was a little kid. That really came on much later on. My parents were traveling over to Europe more. They got into wine. And next thing I knew, they were taking me along when I'd come home to the wine tastings. I was in law school up in St. Louis, but my last year, I came to the realization that law, my heart really wasn't into it. I didn't want to, when I graduated, become a lawyer. I had this feeling that I wanted to do something entrepreneurial, had to do something with my hands, actually make something. For years, Jonathan and I had talked with my dad about starting a winery or brewery when my brother and I retired. It'd be something fun to do together as a family. I remembered back a few years prior that we had visited a small distillery up in Spokane, Washington called Dry Fly. And that's where my brother and my father started joking that instead of starting a brewery or winery when we retired, maybe we should look at distilling.
The idea of a distillery started as a joke. I always firmly held the idea that it was going to actually come to fruition. I don't smile the most often, but I am the eternal optimist of the group. In terms of starting a distillery, I actually tested the waters with my dad one day. We were sitting on the couch having a whiskey, and he mentioned how much fun he had on the trip to Spokane, Washington, a dry fly, and couldn't wait for us to start a distillery one day, and that maybe we should do it even sooner. And so my ears kind of perked up.
And so it wasn't until Christmas dinner when I finally decided to come clean to my mom and dad that I was going to graduate in May, but I wasn't going to become a lawyer. Right before the main course was put on the table, I decided that was the perfect time to tell mom and dad. And I remember it was dead silence the moment I said it.
I think I probably just took a big breath at that point, and it is Christmas dinner, so I kind of am looking around, and John always tries to lighten up the situation.
Well, my first instinct was not to say anything, and so to kind of break that silence, I basically said, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to start that distillery?
And that's the moment that all the things kind of coalesced, and I was like, yes, that's exactly what I want to do.
Probably in my head, I'm thinking, darn, I just finished paying for law school.
I'll never forget, Mom asked me, she's like, I know you know how to drink whiskey, but do you have any idea how to make it? And the answer was no. I had no idea how to make it at the time.
I think that as a family, we always try to support one another. And the kids had good educations, so I wasn't too worried that they wouldn't land on their feet.
My first thought was, I don't know how in the world he thinks he could start a distillery. He doesn't know anything about it. He's never done it. I mean, we visited one once. I'm thinking, okay, if we're gonna do this, what is it that we're gonna have to do? Because I like things planned.
Marcia is a force of nature. She doesn't do anything halfway. She goes into everything with her full heart. she suggested that we head out to Kentucky and see what distilling bourbon was all about. Next thing I know, she had booked hotels, she had booked a rental car, and we hit the road. So the first person we met on this trip was Ted Huber of Starlight Distillery in Indiana. He took Marcia and I aside and we talked about some of our plans of what we were going to do on the trip. And he stopped us right there and he said,
well, if you're going to go into craft, you don't want to go on the bourbon trail. And I thought, oh, darn, I really wanted to go on the bourbon trail. And he said, if you're going to go into craft distilling, you need to find smaller distilleries and talk to them.
Our next stop was at Vendome. We talked to Rob Sherman. The folks at Vendome are extraordinarily gracious, especially for two people walking into their office without an appointment, with no idea about what type of still we wanted to do or what type of products we were wanting to make. I'll never forget the very first question was, well, how many gallons of whiskey per hour do you want to make?
Rob and I had no idea what he was talking about. It was like deer in the headlights.
And I'm sure he was looking at us at the time like, oh boy, these guys got a long way to go. But before we had left, we got to go see big column stills. We got to see the small hybrid stills they were building at the time. And they had us put our name on a logbook.
And I thought it was like the guest booking. I didn't really think anything about it. Little did I know that signature was going to be one step of, I always say, fate brought us into this, and that was step one.
Every time we visited one of the distilleries and we told them that we were interested in starting our own distillery, they tried to convince us not to do it. They said it's 10 times harder, 10 times more expensive than you would ever think it's going to be. If you have the passion for it, then go for it. But if you're not dedicated to doing this, then it is not worth you doing. So that trip really opened my eyes to what I didn't know, which was a lot. And so we knew pretty quickly, Marcia and I and Jonathan were talking, that we really needed to get experience and go visit distilleries across the country. And over the next 6 months, that's exactly what we did. We traveled to Chicago, visited Koval and did a class there. We went to Spokane, Washington, back to our original inspiration, and actually did a week of production at dry fly distilling. But we decided to kind of expand beyond whiskey, and that's when we signed up to do a brandy distilling class with Hubris Germain Bourbon. And that was a class that sent us in an entirely different direction than we ever thought possible.
So we had quite a few what I would call mentors early on. One that was very instrumental in what we do on the maturation side was going to be Nancy Fraley and Hubris Germain Bourbon. They taught Robert and I about the brandy maturation techniques that we actually use here in Texas for different reasons they would use in France.
I've had the opportunity to go over to Cognac and distill there. We started to learn about tasting barrels and evaluating barrels and kind of all the different processes that occur during maturation and how the French handle the tannins of French oak and how they handle long-term maturation versus short-term maturation. It was really an eye-opening experience that the world of maturation was much larger than we had thought prior to it.
My daughter-in-law at that Christmas dinner only gave Jonathan one stipulation. She says, I'll support whatever you guys do as long as you take me back to Texas.
Well, we've had a really long connection to Texas. My brother was born in El Paso. That's where my parents, when they first left Montana, that's where they first moved down to El Paso. You know, I guess the saying goes, that, at least for me, that you may not have been born here, but you got here as fast as you could, so.
I said, well, you better get out there and go see what they're doing in Texas.
When we decided to start visiting some of the distilleries here, there were two distilleries that really stuck out, both Balcones and Garrison brothers.
Robert basically wandered into Balcones, and you're not really even supposed to wander into Balcones back then. They had basically gatekeepers, and I'm not sure how Robert got in there. He's good at that. And it happened to be on a day when Chip Tate was down there, and he said he was open for consulting. And so we got to know Chip and Jared before the kind of Balcones split. And so we were able to learn a lot from those two.
Hubris had really planted the idea of tannin control in our mind. And on the visit down to Texas, it became really apparent that tannin is a big issue in these warmer climates. Potentially we could use some of these French techniques to help manage that tannin issue we see in the warm climate that we have here in Texas. Originally, we were going to order a traditional pot still from Forsyth, but upon attempting to place the order, they informed us that their production capacity had been purchased up for the next several years.
And so we said, we can't wait that long. We've got to start this business. I've pretty much already quit my job, so we've got to get going. It was disheartening at that point, and it was frustrating, and there's only 2 still manufacturers that were making pot stills of that size, and one of them just told us no.
We began to panic because we knew we wanted to make whiskey from the very beginning, so we decided to call Vendome and talk to them about making a traditional Scottish pot still. We spoke with Rob Sherman, and he again informed us that the wait would be several years, but when we told him our name, he actually paused for a second. I'll never forget this kind of long pause, and he goes, "Hold up, let me go look at something really fast." A few minutes later, he came back to the phone, and he goes, "Well, Robert, you're not gonna believe this, but you're actually 3rd on the list for getting a still produced. So we actually will start production on it in 3 months if we can get the design and a down payment in." It turns out that log book that Marcia signed years before at Vendome wasn't a log book at all. It was actually a list to get a still made.
We were celebrating. We were so excited. And then he said, "But we only have a couple of weeks to design it."
When the volumes that we were looking at producing, Vendome basically said, you can use a pot still, you probably don't need a continuous column still. We wanted to make things other than bourbon. We wanted to make single malt. We wanted to make an Irish style, but we predominantly wanted to make bourbon, and we knew that we could make bourbon on it because we'd known that even the old Kentucky stills at one point were pot stills. The other aspect of it was the French were using pot stills. So they were using alembic pot stills for the cognac production, and a lot of our training was coming from that side. That's the nice thing about Vendome is we get to design all the angles, the diameters, the height of things. The way we did it was we bought a bunch of single malt, and then we drank that single malt while we looked at pictures on the internet of the stills that it came off of. And eventually, after we had tasted quite a few single malts, we realized that we like a particular still shape. Part of that still shape is the downward line arm on it, and what that creates is a lot heavier kind of spirit. All the vapor that's going up there, instead of refluxing in the line arm and going back to the pot and being redistilled, it actually just goes down into the condenser. So if it makes it up to the line arm, it's going down into the condenser, we're going to collect it. And so that creates a heavy spirit, and I wanted to make a bourbon that had a ton of mouthfeel to it, and that was one of the ways we were able to do it. And so we ended up getting this pot still behind me in about 8 months, and that actually saved our business.
With the business plan now coming together, it was time to find a home. Marcia, Jonathan, and I started looking all around the state of Texas, trying to figure out where would be the perfect place for us to put a distillery. We searched down in Austin, we saw there were a number of distilleries down there, so we decided to look in North Texas, around the Dallas area. We visited a bunch of small towns. Unfortunately for us, most of them were dry. They were very much not interested in us being in the towns. We're about to give up, actually. One of my professors from college actually called me.
And she said, "Well, have you thought about Denison?" And he said, "No, I really hadn't." And she said, "Why don't you come up here? We'll show you around."
And the next day, that's what we did. We drove up to Denison. We met with Tony Kai, who's in charge of the economic development here. We met with the mayor and some of the other elders of the city, and they were really excited to have us.
We had already been focused on distilleries and breweries and wineries to locate in our downtown to make it an entertainment district, and knew they were serious, knew they were a very intelligent family, and started on the site search for a building.
And then as we went forward and as we looked at buildings and made choices, our wonderful distillery fell in our hands.
And we knew that this was going to be kind of home, especially when you look at that history, wanting to use cognac techniques to make spirits, make whiskey here in Texas. It only felt natural to be in the city that is actually sister cities with cognac. When we informed Hubris that we were coming back to Texas, he left us with 2 really big questions. Number 1 was, what does Texas brandy taste like? And the second one was, what does Texas whiskey taste like? And this is, again, circa 2011. So the answer to the first question was really easy. That is, Hubris, there is no Texas brandy. We're going to get to Texas, we'll find some grapes and we'll use what you taught us. When it came to Texas whiskey, though, we really only had 2 examples that we could go to, which was Garrison Brothers Bourbon and Balcones Baby Blue Corn Whiskey. Those 2 whiskeys don't taste anything alike, so my brother went back and asked Hubris, like, Hubris, since there's not a traditional way of making whiskey and bourbon in the state of Texas, like, where would you begin? And Hubris said the most French thing he could have to us, which was, boys, just stick with the terroir and you'll be fine.
When Hubris said, follow the terroir, we said, okay, what's made in our local area? And what's grown here is going to be corn. And so I said, well, that's going to narrow it down.
Diving into that concept of terroir, it was something that was really important to us. We wanted to really make a whiskey that felt like it came from Texas and just wasn't a cheap knockoff of Kentucky bourbon. Jonathan started talking about how in Kentucky, a lot of times they use either wheat or rye as the flavoring grain. Jonathan wanted to explore what that would mean in Texas, to look at local grains that grow here and how we can use that to be our flavoring grain to kind of differentiate us.
And I was reading an article about moonshiners in the Appalachian Mountains, and they were using this thing called Bloody Butcher corn. And they started talking about the description of the flavors of Bloody Butcher corn. It had these dark red fruit notes to it, and it was a little bit sweeter. And that was the first time I'd ever heard anybody talk about corn in terms of flavor.
And that really kind of stuck out to my brother, because having tasted some of the blue corn products from Balcones, he knew those were really unique and really different. And so he kind of theorized that maybe corn was a little bit like grapes, and the fact that if you used different species of corn, you could get really different flavors.
So you could only get seeds of Bloody Butcher corn. And so I talked John and Marcia into growing the first set to see what we could do with a test batch of it.
And so we planted it in our gardens in Illinois, and John and I took the summer so carefully watching every plant, and at the end of the season we harvested our ears, and then we laid it out to dry. We had at the end only 50 pounds of corn, but Jonathan said,
what if we used it like it's a flavoring grain and see if it actually has any flavor? And so we just used a small percentage of it, and the second we got that, it was coming off the still, we knew it was wildly different.
And so we decided to go down that route with corn. And through the last decade, we've actually distilled over 55 different species of grains and have found a litany of different flavors.
But the 4 core mash bills that we have, 3 of those are going to be 100% corn. So there's going to be one that's got 5% purple corn in it, one that's got 5% flint corn in it, one that's 5% Bloody Butcher corn, and one that's a low rye.
Coming from that French tradition of that notion of making something that really truly comes from this place, for me that felt perfect.
So when it came to the distillery, it was a pretty well divided area of expertise for both. So you had Robert that was looking at contracts, he was looking at the legal ramifications. Jonathan was more interested in how do you create the stuff and make a good product.
Okay, so the way we make bourbon is we start out with the mash tank behind me and about 400 gallons of water. We'll add to that about 1,300 pounds of milled corn. We do that at about 140 degrees, and then we'll bring that up to a boiling temperature. We do use exogenous enzymes, so we'll add those in at different points during this process. If it's going to be 100% corn, we'll boil that for the hour, and then we have to drop it back down. That's the hard part in Texas, is cooling the temperature back down so we can pitch yeast. Chilling is always the thing we're lacking in Texas, no matter which distillery we're talking to. We actually pitch yeast directly into the mash tank. Predominantly, we'll use an M1 yeast, which is an old school Scotch yeast. It's also used in the Caribbean for rum production. Everything is grain on here, so we're going to transfer all of that corn slurry at that point into a fermenter. We're going to do the on-grain fermentation. We do that for a couple different reasons. One, we want to get as much yield as we possibly can out of it. The other reason we really like it is because that's where we get our mouthfeel. All those oils and everything are going to get transferred over into the still, and we're going to get everything when we distill it. It's going to sit there for 7 days, and then what we'll do is we'll actually transfer 2 of our fermenters into the big pot still. We like to do double distillation like you would see in the cognac world or in a lot of single malt. The first distillation, we're just going to strip out all the different alcohols, good and bad, from the corn and water, and then that's when we actually make our cuts. We like to run pretty slowly. Our spirit runs will take us 13 to 14 hours. And so our heart's portion of that cut is going to end up being about 4.5 hours long. That comes off the still, it's going to be about 140 proof aggregate. We barrel in a little bit larger cooperage, so we're in a 65-gallon barrel instead of the typical 53. Entry proof wise, we started out at 118, then we went to 125, and now that we're using the bigger cooperage, we're having to go back to 118 proof. From there, the barrels go into the back. Once it's back there, it's aging. We use a variety of different types of cooperage. We'll use American oak, we'll use European oak, we'll use a touch of French oak. All the stuff for bourbon is going to be first use, it's going to be charred. And then what we'll do is we'll start a process that we call Texas élevage. Once those barrels become a certain age, what we're going to do is we're going to taste through the barrels and we're going to predetermine what's going to happen to those barrels at that point in time. One of the things that'll happen right out the gate is we'll start proofing them down slowly towards that proof it's going to be at. If the barrels are getting a little spicy to them, we can actually move them around in the warehouse. We know which flavors come from which parts of the warehouse. If we want to add a little bit more oak, we can put those on the south side wall. That's where we get our honey barrels. We are able to use the Texas heat and kind of manipulate it to produce some of what we want and coax certain flavors out of the wood.
Bourbon is the spirit of the United States. It's got very strict rules, and we protect that really well with the laws. When it comes to corn whiskey, the rules are way more open. Because corn whiskey can be aged in used barrels and non-charred barrels, we're able to, because of the ability to use used barrels, to actually employ way more of the traditional French techniques when it comes to maturation.
And in hindsight, it makes a lot of sense in Texas to use used cooperage because you get a much lighter spirit coming out of it in such a heavily dynamic environment. It makes a lot of sense. So the difference in corn whiskey and bourbon, it can have to do with the original mash bills, but it has more to do with the cooperage. So where bourbon has to be 51% corn whiskey has to be 80% corn, but you can have 100% corn bourbon. After you go over the 80% corn, if it's in brand new charred oak, it's bourbon. If it's not, if it's in used charred oak or if it's in some type of toasted barrel, then it's corn whiskey.
When we were in Cognac, we met Axel at Gros Perrin, and they had a beautiful brass bell in their cellar. And when she would ring it, she would say, "Feel that reverberation? It travels through us, it travels through the liquid and through the barrels, and it connects us and it reminds us that we don't do this alone." When you create cognac, you make it for your grandchildren. And so you are thanking all the people that have made the life that you live possible. So we have a bell here that we ring in remembrance of our friends that have passed and all of the people that help us create the spirits that we're able to produce. When Ironroot creates spirits, we do it where one mash bill features bloody butcher corn, the next one will feature purple corn, the next will feature flint corn, the next one's rye, and so on. And it depends on how we choose to blend those together. Our Harbinger usually has more of the bloody butcher and the purple corn. It is a little more traditional. And then the opposite of the mash bill is the Promethean, which adds that Floriani. And the Floriani is the one corn that really adds that little umami. It adds more of that herbalness that you get from rye. Apotheosis is where we wanted to explore finishes on whiskeys. We've done Pinot de Charente, we've done an Amburano with a sherry finish with it. And then we had Hubris. Hubris is a corn whiskey. It is 100% purple corn, and it's aged in used bourbon barrels that have held our purple corn. Icarus was created using Hubris. So we took our favorite Hubris and we put it in tawny port barrels and we put some in peat barrels, and then we blended it together, and that became Icarus. Hubris, as we tasted it, we put it in European oak instead of American oak, and it became our favorite barrel. And we absolutely love this barrel. And Rob then said, this is going to be the barrel. Let's send it off to competition to see if anybody else likes it. And Jonathan said, no. If you're going to, you're going to have to call it Hubris because that's what you are.
In 2017, Jonathan and I went to our first World Whiskies Awards ceremony in New York. And we thought we were really cool just being invited to go. You know, rubbing shoulders with all the really wonderful people in the industry. We didn't expect to win. We didn't expect to be called up on stage, but when they started announcing the corn whiskey, Hubris was named America's best corn whiskey. I think Jonathan and I almost fainted when they called our name. I jumped a little bit, probably embarrassingly, to be in the room with all those wonderful people. Ran up on stage, and it's a night I don't think Jonathan and I will ever forget. Fortunately for us, it wasn't a fluke. We've continued over the last few years to win awards from the World Whiskies Awards and other awards from around the world. It's just a pleasure to be able to share this kind of vision that we've had for Texas whiskey with everyone across the world.
The Likarishes are about family and about doing something together as a family that matters. They happened to choose whiskey. We're all very grateful.
I think Ironroot will be known for making some of the highest quality and most innovative products to come out of the Texas spirits industry.
It's been really cool to watch them grow as a distillery. And I remember celebrating their 5th year anniversary. Now we're about to celebrate their 10th year anniversary. And it doesn't matter how good the whiskey is. If the people behind it aren't as good, it's really hard to fall in love with that brand. While the whiskey's good, the people behind it make the whiskey better.
I feel embraced. They are loyal to us, and we are loyal to them. If you've been a fan and supported the brand for a while, know that you are already a part of the family.
Just one big family making some great whiskey.
So much tourism comes to Denison now because of Ironroot. You know, it's really made our community proud.
I've been in the economic development business for over 40 years, and I've done all different sizes projects. This Ironroot project is the most amazing project that I've worked on. To see what was accomplished by this community and that family is an amazing story. That's a story that I tell to other small businesses that come to our community that want to be successful. Here's a model of how to be successful.
We've put 10 years in, and it was a snap of the fingers. I believe in my sons. I believe in what they're doing. I think they've made really good choices so that the distillery will have the opportunity to grow.
A legacy is something that you have to build. It's not easy to build a legacy. Having won awards is one thing, but to see customers taste the whiskeys and know that they were the ones who created it and that it gives enjoyment to other people, I think that's the biggest success.
If you have a little bit of encouragement, it just keeps building and building, and that builds your confidence. I think when you build your confidence, it was also gave us the ability when other new distillers would come in, we'd say, it's okay, you're gonna be okay. You can do it. We can do it together. We can make Texas whiskey.
We hope you enjoyed this journey into the past, present, and future of Ironroot Republic. If you have any questions about Ironroot or Texas whiskey, drop us a comment and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel.